This is an upgrade of one of my most viewed videos, and it's put together with the end, which was in another video, and it didn't get watched as much, but the end is interesting and I think it'll be useful for you. So I wanted to put them together and upgrade the sound, and here it is. It looks like this is going to be a series of videos about making piece molds with plaster. I think it's a great way to start if you haven't ever made molds before, because it's relatively easy, it's inexpensive, and you can learn a lot by making a few plaster piece molds. I'm Diane van der Zanden. This is Atelier Arenas in Colima, Mexico. And if you've already watched some of my videos, you know that I developed a new method for working with papier-mâché in plaster molds to make lightweight, durable, hollow paper sculptures. So what I'm going to talk about in this video and show you is the two-piece plaster mold that I'm making of the skirt for a piece that's in this series of sculptures. Here we go. In the clip, you can see the already made paper torso that's on top. Here, I'm making the wooden base to make the mold bed so that I can separate the pieces of plaster in the end. I'm making the mold bed out of plasticine, which I really like because it doesn't shrink. You can use water-based clay, but if you walk away from it for a week, it may shrink and dry up, and you won't have a great result. I like to protect my sculpture by putting plastic in between the plasticine sculpture and the plasticine that I'm going to make the mold bed out of. I put the plasticine here in the sun, makes it easier to use to make molds. This plasticine is soft, and I use this just for mold walls and mold wells. I'm building up around the sculpture with wood so that I don't have to use too much plasticine or take too much time to build up this mold wall. I like to cut my sculptures into parts in order to make the molds, and I actually really like to work on the sculpture when it's in the mold. It makes it a lot easier for me to do the work that needs to be done to smooth the sculpture. You can see here that I'm completely smoothing the mold bed, because the smoother the plasticine is, the longer the plaster sculpture will last. I also used to work with a lot of texture in my sculptures, but that doesn't work for these smaller pieces with using the paper pieces to make the sculpture. The paper pieces just don't take on texture very well. I'm lucky to have this great mold making space here outside my studio. And what I do is I get everything out, I get the sculpture out, I get all the tools, all the plaster, the water, all the cleanup buckets, and everything that I need, because once I start mixing plaster, it's hard to really think about anything else. Another thing is that you don't want to wash the plaster down your pipes. I use a 5-gallon bucket with water in it, and I clean the plaster up there. I keep my plaster dry in a dry bin, and I make sure that I put mold release on everything, including the wood and everything else, before I start mixing plaster. I'm using the Michelangelo method of mixing plaster, which means you get a bucket, you fill it not more than half of the way up with water, and then you start sifting plaster into the bucket until you get a dry hill on the top of that water. If there's a little bit of clear water on the outside when you're done, you probably need to put a little more plaster in. And when the plaster sinks all the way down and absorbs all the water, then you can start stirring without introducing air bubbles. I usually stir it with my hand. I can feel when the plaster is homogeneous and smooth when I do that, but sometimes I use a brush. It's fine if you don't want to do it with your hand and you want to use a brush. Just don't introduce air bubbles into it. I really like making mold wells, either with metal walls or wooden walls or using plasticine. The reason is because then I can mix a bucket of plaster and pour it myself. The only thing is that liquid plaster is really heavy, and so I have to make sure that there are no holes where the liquid plaster is going to go running out through the mold. And I've had that problem before. So if you have it, if you end up with that problem, don't be shocked. Just grab yourself a handful of plasticine and plug up where the plaster is running out. I put in some of the plaster and then I brush and brush so that any bubbles that are attached to any piece of the mold bed of the plasticine is here and the sculpture is here. The bubbles like to get right in there and stay. And so I brush all around that part, and having a mold well allows me the time to get into there before the plaster starts to cure. This is a pila, which is very common in Mexico. Pila literally means a pile, but it also means a battery. So this is a storage tank for water, and it's also a wonderful utility sink. I build up the plaster as it turns into this sort of frosting-like consistency, and over time and as it cures, it'll turn almost as hard as stone. It's very workable, and even after it gets very hard and cured, you can still add to it, or you can sculpt into it and take some off. Today I'm going to build part 2 of the 2-piece mold for the skirt. Here I'm putting up the mold well again, because like I said, this is the way that I like to work. Makes it easier. I had some work done on my roof, and I forgot to put plastic over this piece. You know, it's so dusty here that normally I put plastic over everything, but this time I forgot. But anyway, it didn't end up being too hard to fix. I just wiped it off and smoothed it out again. If you clean the plaster up right away, then it's really easy to do. We do it in a 5-gallon bucket, the water evaporates, and it gets hard and we throw it in the trash. I'm smoothing the mold release here because I don't want the lines of the brush marks to get transferred into the plaster mold. So mixing plaster again here, Michelangelo method. Make sure that you wait until the water is completely absorbed into the plaster before you start stirring, and don't introduce air bubbles. Danny came again today to help me mix plaster and to help me clean up, and it's so helpful. We make batch after batch until I get the piece to be between 1 inch and 1.5 inches thick. I used to only wait 1 hour to open the mold, and you can do that. But usually these days I at least let them sit overnight. And if there's sun, I let them sit in the sun and let the plasticine warm up so it's easy to get it off. Then if I've used threaded rod, I unscrew the nuts and take all the wood pieces off, and then use screwdrivers to open up the mold parts. I'm so happy with this. It looks really, really good. Occasionally, the plaster on the inside of the mold gets ripply or something like that, but in this case, it looks great. And here I'm taking the plasticine out of the mold, which I'm really, really struggling with doing. Oftentimes I can sit the mold in the sun with the plasticine in it, and the plasticine will get warm enough for me to just be able to grab it and take it out. But in this case, I couldn't. So I went and got a piece of pipe and I stuck that around my threaded rod, which I was using to make the sculpture in the first place. And I pulled, just stuck it in there and pulled on the rod and was able to pull the thing out. Remind me never to use bead foam again. Bead foam is such a pain in the tush. What I found also is that these kind of long mold pieces made out of plaster can warp. And so usually I strap them with mold straps. And in the US, in the north, I would use inner tube material or something like that. But inner tube material just melts here in the heat. So for the moment, I'm taping the two pieces together with masking tape. I'm sorry about this terrible videography here. I bought a new camera and I'm trying to figure out how to use it. But what I'm showing here is putting on the mold soap and just layer after layer of mold soap until I get to 10 layers on this mold. And these legs are the next in the lineup for mold making, so stay tuned. Here's the mold, all done, all dry, all released with its 10 layers of paper inside. The video about the joining of this piece will probably come out in around March when it's really dry here outside. This is, I think, the end of this video. I'm sure that there's something else that you want to know when you're doing this. Definitely leave me comments. I'm answering all the comments that I'm getting right now. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe. Thanks. I really appreciate you.